It is often said that the currency of Washington is not the dollar but the secret, and for decades the balance of power in our capital has rested on a delicate equilibrium of mutually assured destruction, where opposing factions hold enough damaging information on one another to ensure that certain lines are never crossed and certain systems remain intact, regardless of who nominally holds the presidency or the gavel in the Senate. You might look at the headlines flashing across your screen today about panic at Dulles Airport or the sudden silence of normally vocal Senate leaders and think you are watching a simple political scandal unfold or a personal vendetta playing out on a grand scale. But what you are actually witnessing is something far more systemic and far more dangerous to the established order of things, which is the total liquidation of political capital and the collapse of the unspoken agreements that have governed elite behavior for half a century. When we talk about markets, we usually talk about stocks or bonds or commodities, but there is a market for influence and immunity that operates with just as much volatility. And right now, we are seeing the equivalent of a market crash in the reputation and legitimacy of the ruling class, because the ledger that kept everyone honest or perhaps dishonest but compliant has just been opened for the world to see. You need to understand that what happened yesterday with the Senate vote and the subsequent release of these unredacted files is not just a news story. It is a structural rupture in the mechanism of governance, because for years we have operated under the assumption that the most explosive liabilities of our leaders would remain hidden, not to protect national security, as the talking heads are claiming right now, but to protect the stability of the institution itself. Think about your own workplace or your own community, and imagine if every private transgression and every compromised moment of the people in charge was suddenly dumped into the public square, not as a leak, but as an official act of state policy, and you will begin to grasp the magnitude of the shockwave that is currently hitting the Beltway. We are conditioned to view these events as soap operas with good guys and bad guys, but I want you to look closer at the economics of this situation, because what we are seeing is a distressed asset dump where a political actor who feels he has nothing left to lose decides to burn the very currency that the rest of the town uses to trade favors and maintain control. The specific document in question, which we are calling the Epstein client list, is really a balance sheet of compromised leverage that has likely been used behind closed doors to whip votes, to silence dissent, and to steer policy for years. And by declassifying it, the former leverage holder has effectively zeroed out the value of that blackmail, which explains why the panic is so visceral and so immediate. You are watching people who thought they were insulated by the system suddenly realize that the insurance policy they bought with their silence has been canceled. And this matters to you not just because it is shocking or salacious, but because these are the people who write your tax laws, who decide where your pension funds are invested, and who vote on whether to send your children to war. When the veil of immunity is pierced in this way, it reveals the extent to which our legislative process has been held hostage, not by ideology or public interest, but by private vulnerabilities and shadow debts that are now being called in all at once. We have to ask ourselves how we arrived at a point where the governance of the most powerful nation on earth could be so brittle that the release of a single flight log or a list of associates could threaten to topple the leadership of the Senate and send the political class into hiding. This speaks to a profound fragility in our institutions, where power is concentrated in the hands of a few who are bound together not by duty to the Constitution, but by a shared fear of exposure. And when that fear is weaponized, it ceases to be a tool of discipline and becomes a weapon of mass institutional destruction. You might be wondering why this particular list matters more than the dozens of other scandals that seem to break every week, and the answer lies in the nature of the names involved and the timing of the release, because this was not a random leak from a hacker, but a calculated strategic strike authorized by the executive against the legislative branch in a moment of existential conflict. It is important to strip away the sensationalism and look at the incentives that drove this decision. Because in any high-stakes negotiation in politics is the highest stakes negotiation of all, a player who faces total defeat has a rational incentive to flip the table if they believe the game is rigged against them. The reports coming out of the West Wing about scorching earth warfare suggest that we have moved beyond the realm of normal political competition into a phase of systemic liquidation, where the goal is no longer to win the next election, but to destroy the capacity of the opposition to govern or to command public trust. You are seeing the result of a failure to integrate a disruption into the system where instead of absorbing the shock, the system tried to expel it, and in doing so triggered a failsafe that was never meant to be used. The media narrative you are hearing right now about national security risks is a classic example of what we call information asymmetry, where the gatekeepers of information try to convince the public that ignorance is safety, but in reality, the risk they are managing is the risk to their own credibility and the stability of the relationships that allow Washington to function as a company town. When you hear that private jets are scrambling, it is the physical manifestation of capital flight, but in this case, the capital is social standing and legal immunity fleeing a jurisdiction that has suddenly become hostile to the corrupt status quo. We have to consider what this means for the average citizen who looks at their government and expects a basic level of competence and integrity, only to find that the people at the wheel were potentially compromised by a ring of exploitation that was known and tolerated by the very institutions charged with investigating it. This is where the story connects directly to your life and your wallet, because a government that is run by people who are vulnerable to this kind of blackmail is a government that cannot act in your best interest, because its primary objective becomes self-preservation rather than public service. If a senator votes for a spending bill or a regulation, not because it helps the economy or creates jobs, but because they are terrified that a file will be released if they do not, then you are not living in a representative democracy. You are living in a protection racket disguised as a republic. The release of these files disrupts that racket. And while the immediate result is chaos and confusion, the long-term implication is a forced reckoning with the reality of who has been making the decisions that shape your economic future. As we wade through the details of who is on pages 4 and 12, as the reports suggest, we must resist the urge to treat this purely as entertainment, because the implications for the bond market, for the strength of the dollar, and for the stability of the United States as a predictable actor on the world stage are profound and immediate. Markets hate uncertainty, and there is no greater uncertainty than the sudden realization that the legislative branch of the world reserve currency holder is paralyzed by a scandal that implicates its top leadership in heinous crimes. You might see the stock market react, or you might see volatility in the price of gold. And these are not disconnected events. They are the financial expressions of a loss of faith in the institutional framework that underpins the entire global economy. The silence from the Senate leadership that the reports mention is the silence of a debtor who has just been told that the loan has been called and they do not have the liquidity to pay. And in this case, the currency is legitimacy and they are bankrupt. We are going to walk through how this leverage was likely constructed and how the economy of secrets allowed certain figures to maintain power long past their expiration date, because understanding the mechanics of this shadow economy is the only way to understand why they acted the way they did and why the release of this information is viewed as a nuclear option. It is not just about embarrassment, it is about the structural removal of the pillars that held up the ceiling of the Senate. And without those pillars, the roof is coming down on everyone inside. We need to analyze the specific economic term of moral hazard, because for decades these leaders operated under the belief that they were too big to fail and too important to be exposed, which encouraged reckless behavior and a detachment from the moral standards they preached to you and your family. This disconnect between the private actions of the elite and the public policy they enforce is a tax on the credibility of the state. And right now, we are seeing a massive correction in that market where the artificial value of these reputations is being marked to zero in real time. You are watching a repricing of political assets, and like any market crash, it is painful and chaotic, but it is also a return to reality after a long period of inflated values and fraudulent accounting. As we move deeper into this analysis, keep in mind that the panic you see is not just fear of prison, it is the terror of a closed system being cracked open and exposing the machinery of influence to the light of day, which destroys the mystique that power relies on to function effectively. The independent servers mentioned in the reports ensure that this information cannot be stuffed back into the bottle, which means we are entering a new era of transparency, whether we like it or not, and whether the system is ready for it or not. This is a moment of transition from a managed democracy where difficult truths are suppressed for the greater good of the elite to a volatile open market of information where the cost of corruption is suddenly realized and the bill is presented to the perpetrators immediately. The connection between this political crisis and the broader economy might not seem obvious at first glance, but when the rule of law is revealed to be selective, and when the lawmakers are revealed to be lawbreakers, it erodes the trust that is essential for contracts to be honored and for investments to be made with confidence. You cannot separate the moral character of a nation's leadership from its economic destiny, because corruption functions like a hidden tax that drains resources and misallocates capital away from productive uses and toward the maintenance of cover-ups and hush money networks. What we are seeing is the breaking of a dam that held back decades of toxic assets. And while the flood is destructive, it is also revealing the true landscape that was hidden beneath the water for so long. We are going to look at how this impacts the legislative agenda, because if the leadership of the Senate is decimated by these revelations, then every bill, every budget, and every appointment is suddenly in limbo, which creates a vacuum of power that will be filled by new forces and new dynamics that we have not yet anticipated. Your job, your savings, and your future are tied to the stability of these institutions. And when they shake, the ground under your feet moves too. So it is critical that we face this not with fear, but with a clear understanding of the forces at play. We are witnessing the end of an era of complicity and the beginning of a painful but necessary audit of the books of American power. We have to look at the specific asset class that has just been devalued, which is the asset of reputational immunity, because in the political economy of Washington, reputation is the collateral against which all other loans are secured. If you cannot be trusted to keep a secret, or if your own secrets are suddenly trading at a discount in the public square, then your ability to secure future leverage evokes a liquidity crisis in your personal political capital that spreads contagion to everyone you have ever done business with. You might think of Jeffrey Epstein not merely as a criminal, but in structural terms as a market maker for elite compromise who centralized the liabilities of the ruling class into a single ledger, which created an immense concentration of systemic risk that was ignored by the regulators because they were also the clients. When we talk about systemic risk in banking, we talk about banks that are too big to fail. But here we are talking about individuals who believed they were too connected to fall and who allowed a single point of failure to aggregate enough destructive potential to level the entire legislative branch. The reason the panic is so acute right now and why private jets are reportedly fleeing is that the market for political survival has suddenly gone no bid, meaning there are no buyers for the excuses or the spin that usually work to smooth over a scandal. In a normal crisis, a senator can trade a favor or call in a debt to get a friendly media outlet to kill a story or a prosecutor to look the other way. But this release is a total market collapse where the clearing mechanisms of favors and influence have broken down completely. You are witnessing the margin call of the century, where the debts incurred by decades of moral hazard are being called in all at once, and the people who hold the power are finding out that their accounts are empty. We need to understand the timing of this release relative to the Senate vote mentioned in the reports, because it illustrates a classic game theory dynamic where a defection by one party triggers a scorched earth response from the other. The Senate leadership likely calculated that they could renege on their deal with the executive branch because they assumed the cost of retaliation would be too high for the president to bear, but they failed to price in the desperation of a player who views the alternative as total annihilation. By tearing up the deal on live television, they signaled that the old cooperative equilibrium was over, and in doing so, they unwittingly authorized the deployment of the ultimate weapon, which is the unredacted truth about their own private conduct. This is where the concept of information asymmetry becomes critical for you to understand as a citizen, because for years there has been a massive gap between what the public knows about how decisions are made and what the insiders know. You see a bill passed that hurts your industry or sends your taxes up, and you are told it is for the greater good, while behind closed doors that vote may have been cast solely to prevent a photograph or a flight log entry from seeing the light of day. This means that the legislative history of the last 20 years is not just a record of policy disagreements, but potentially a record of coerced compliance, where the blackmail leverage held by bad actors dictated the laws that govern your life. When we hear that the media is trying to black out this story claiming national security risks, we have to interpret that through the lens of institutional self-preservation, because the major media conglomerates are often intertwined with the same power structures that are now under threat. To admit that the Senate leadership has been compromised by a pedophile ring is to admit that the media failed in its primary duty of oversight for decades or worse, that they were complicit in maintaining the cover-up to protect their access and their standing. You are seeing a desperate attempt to control the narrative supply chain, but because the files are already on independent servers, the monopoly on truth has been broken and the market for information has become decentralized and uncontrollable. The specific mention of pages 4 and 12 implicating high-ranking senators is a detail that transforms this from a general allegation into a specific indictment of the legislative hierarchy. If the people who control the committee assignments and the flow of bills to the floor are the same people who were trading their integrity for access to this illicit network, then every committee report and every floor vote they managed is now suspect. You have to ask yourself if the gridlock or the sudden bipartisan consensus on strange issues was actually the result of the invisible hand of blackmail, moving the pieces on the board to suit the needs of the blackmailers rather than the needs of the American worker. This brings us to the question of the independent servers and the inability of the state to retract this information, which is a technological disruption of the old political model where secrets could be buried in a vault. In the digital age, information is fluid, and once it escapes the container of classification, it replicates infinitely, which means the leverage that the president used has been expended and cannot be used again, but the damage it causes is permanent. The blackmail is over, as the report says, not because the bad guys won, but because the value of the secret dropped to zero the moment it became public knowledge. We should also consider the economic implications of a decapitated Senate leadership because markets crave stability, and the prospect of a mass resignation or a mass prosecution of senior leaders introduces a risk premium into every U.S. asset. Investors who buy U.S. treasuries are betting on the stability of the government, and if the government is revealed to be run by a criminal enterprise, that stability evaporates, and the cost of borrowing for the U.S. government goes up, which eventually means higher interest rates for your mortgage and your credit card. The rot at the top filters down to the bottom, and the cost of this corruption is eventually paid by you in the form of a weaker currency and a more expensive cost of living. You might be feeling a sense of vindication watching this unfold if you have long suspected that the system was rigged, but we must also be wary of the chaos that follows a power vacuum. When a ruling class collapses, it rarely does so quietly, and the struggle to define what comes next will be fierce and likely vicious as different factions try to seize control of the narrative and the institutions. The silence from the Senate leadership is the calm before the storm because they are currently engaged in a frantic calculation of their survival odds, and they are realizing that the legal and social capital they spent a lifetime accumulating is now worthless. We have to analyze the behavior of the president in this scenario not as a hero or a villain, but as a rational actor in a distressed market who decided to liquidate a strategic reserve of intelligence to ensure his own survival. This is not about justice in the abstract sense. It is about the brutal mechanics of power, where the only rule is that you do not corner a tiger unless you are sure you can kill it. The Senate leaders cornered the tiger, and now they are dealing with the consequences of the safe being opened and the files being spilled onto the floor of the global marketplace. As we look at the reaction of the establishment, we can see the stages of grief playing out in real time, starting with denial and moving quickly to anger and bargaining, but there will be no bargaining here because the currency of the bargain has been destroyed. You cannot cut a deal to keep a secret that is already trending on every independent platform in the world. The era of the backroom deal, where the reputations of the powerful were protected by a code of silence, is dead, and we are now living in the wreckage of that system trying to figure out what stands and what falls. This scorching earth warfare is a term that military strategists use to describe destroying the resource base of the enemy, and in this case, the resource base is the public trust and the legitimacy of the opposing political faction. By releasing these names, the president is effectively salting the fields of the Senate leadership, ensuring that they cannot grow any political capital for a generation. It is a ruthless tactic, but it is an effective one if the goal is to permanently disable your opponents rather than just defeat them in a single cycle. You need to think about what this means for the concept of authority in our society, because if the people in the highest offices are revealed to be monsters, then the authority they wield is illegitimate and the laws they pass are suspect. This creates a crisis of compliance where the average citizen looks at the government and asks why they should follow the rules when the rule makers are breaking the most fundamental moral laws of humanity. This is how societies unravel not from invasion, but from the internal decay of the moral fiber of the leadership class. We are watching the liquidation of the credibility of the American political establishment, and while it is terrifying, it is also a necessary correction to a market that has been manipulated for too long. The artificial propping up of these leaders by the media and the intelligence agencies created a bubble of false legitimacy that has finally burst. Now we have to deal with the deflationary spiral of trust that follows, and it will be a hard road, but it is the only path back to a system that is based on reality rather than on the carefully maintained fictions of a compromised elite.